Another technique used to develop melodic motifs is called the sequence. Sequences are, in a sense, the combination of the two techniques learned in the previous videos, repetition and transposition. A sequence is the repetition of a motif 3 or more times, with each repetition being transposed by the same interval higher in pitch or by the same interval lower in pitch. Here is an example. The melodic motif is the 3-note pattern moving up by thirds. The first measure states the motif, C, D, E. The second measure restates the motif with all the pitches a second higher than the first statement, D, E, F. And the last measure restates the motif with all the pitches a second higher than the previous statement, E, F, G. Sequences can be either ascending or descending, but they cannot be both in the same sequence. The diagram below is an ascending sequence because each restatement is higher than the previous one. Here is an example of a descending sequence. Notice how each time the motif is restated, it is played a second lower in pitch, G, F, E, F, E, D, E, D, C. Sequences do not necessarily need to move higher or lower by seconds, although this is one of the most common ways. They can also move higher or lower by any other interval. Here is an example of an ascending sequence that is moving higher by thirds. As you can see in the diagram, each time the motif is restated, it is played a third higher. First on C, then on E flat, and then finally on G. Besides being ascending or descending in nature, sequences can also either be diatonic or chromatic, sometimes referred to as non-diatonic. Here's an example of a diatonic sequence. A diatonic sequence simply means that each time the motif is restated, it remains in the same key. That is, it uses only pitches from that particular key or scale. Because of this, there will usually be slight differences in the proportional distance between the pitches. For example, if you look at the pattern of half steps and whole steps in the first measure, you will find that the movement of pitches is whole, whole, half, whole. If you look at the pattern of half steps and whole steps in the second measure, you will find that the movement of pitches is half, half, whole, whole. In order to keep the distance between the pitches exactly the same from one statement of the motif to the next, we would need to sharp or flat certain notes in the second and third measures. If we did this, we would be using pitches that are not found in the key, and thus the sequence would be called chromatic rather than diatonic. Remember, diatonic simply refers to the major and minor scales. Here is an example of a chromatic sequence. As you can see, we have preserved the pattern of half steps and whole steps by the addition of sharps in the second and third measure. Each statement of the motif has the same pattern, whole, whole, half, whole. Because we have added pitches that are not found in the key, remember C major contains no sharps or flats, we call this sequence chromatic. Writing sequences is a very easy way of creating melodies out of motifs. In fact, sequences were quite common in 18th and 19th century classical music.